For a full 30 seconds the room watched a recording of my voice and no one looked at me the same way again. My name is Marcus Hale, I am 38, and for the last 12 years I oversaw the operations and systems that kept our company running. I could walk the server room blindfolded, knew every maintenance window and emergency script, and had the kinds of little habits that made systems hum when pressure rose. I knew which backup process sighed under load, which vendor support line answered faster at 3 in the morning, and how to coax a stubborn database into cooperating without dropping transactions. Those things mattered because downtime cost real money and sleepless executives, but they mattered to me because I had made myself dependable in a world that rewarded predictability. In the conference room, a flat screen hummed and the air smelled faintly of coffee gone stale. The recording was just my voice, flattened by compression, reading a log excerpt I had written months ago during a late shift. It should have sounded ordinary, but every sentence in that clipped playback landed like evidence. People shifted in their chairs. A woman 2 seats over pinched the bridge of her nose the way she used to do when we argued about deployment windows. I felt the weight of their attention slide off the screen and land on me, but not with the familiar gratitude that usually came my way when I solved a problem. This was something else. It was a look I had never earned and had no rehearsal for. Outside work, my life had been compact and deliberate. I lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor above a bakery, where mornings smelled of butter and my kettle clicked like a metronome. I had a single mattress with a sag where I had learned to sleep through perimeter scans and emergency pings, a bookshelf with manuals and a few novels, and a kitchen table that had served as my command center for years. My sister called me when she needed advice, and I answered because she trusted that I would make sense of messy choices. My friends knew I could untangle accounts and hardware, and also that I preferred Thai takeout and board games on Sunday nights. My calendar had margins for life and for work. I kept those margins deliberately because systems needed time to breathe, and because I needed time to be more than a problem solver. The office was a noisy, familiar ecosystem of late-night pizza boxes collapsing under empty plates, whiteboard arguments that devolved into laughter, and a kind of mutual reliance that felt like a second skin. We had rituals that were as much about trust as about efficiency. People trusted me with passwords and vendor relationships, with the little keys that opened big doors. I was the human index of institutional memory, the guy colleagues called when a script failed or when a new hire needed a history lesson about why something had always been done the old way. I thrived on that usefulness. It was a quiet power that came with headlamp vigilance and the patience to keep going when others clocked out. So when that recording played, the sound of my own voice became a physical object in the room, something people could point at and inspect. The way the conference lights glared on the television made a faint ghost of my face hover in the glass, and for a moment I imagined reaching out to touch that shadow and see if it would tremble. My palms were sweating against my suit. I could feel every callus on my fingertips as if they were evidence of a life spent on keyboards and server racks. The recording was nothing theatrical. It was just data spoken aloud, but in that sterile context it was turned into accusation by tone and timing. I remembered small things in that moment. The quirk in the build servers that required me to run a manual script on Fridays, the name of the technician who always left his coffee on the same battered desk, the way I once stayed overnight to reroute traffic during a holiday outage. Those memories were tactile and warm and ordinary. They had formed a lattice of trust I had been proud to inhabit. People had relied on me to keep their jobs from collapsing at 2 in the morning. They had trusted that I would preserve truth in logs and preserve operations in crises. That trust braided itself into my sense of identity until it felt as sturdy as the metal racks that held our hardware. Now, as the playback finished and the room exhaled, the trust felt like glass in my hands. The faces around me registered varying degrees of confusion, curiosity, and the soft, lethal thing that masquerades as caution. My mouth tasted metallic, my throat made a small noise that I hoped sounded like breathing and not like betrayal. I tried to anchor myself by cataloging the familiar, the server hum in my head, the faint smell of solder from the lab, my own handwriting on sticky notes that clung to my monitor. Each detail was a proof point of a life arranged around order and accountability. Yet the room had folded that life into a single minute of audio and assessed it on its own terms. The assessment felt immediate and irrevocable. I had spent a dozen years building the place where everyone could leave at reasonable hours and still trust that systems would hold. I had taught junior engineers to read logs like weather reports and coached vendors to meet our timelines. I had blurred the line between my work life and my identity until I could no longer tell which sacrifices were professional necessity and which were my measure of worth. That was why the moment that recording played felt like a physical strike. It was not just that my voice had been made evidence. It was that the thing I used as proof of myself was suddenly in dispute in a room where once it had been assumed. They slid the packet across the polished table like an accusation you could hold. HR had the kind of light that made everything look official, bright, impartial, unforgiving. The pages were clipped together with a binder clip and bore a neat header from audit, a logo I knew too well. On the cover was a title I could not unsee, Unauthorized Transfers Incident Report. Someone had printed my work into evidence and reduced a life to timestamps and redactions. I opened it because my hands moved before my mind did. The pages smelled faintly of copier toner and office air. There were logs, rows of entries I recognized by rhythm more than content times, session IDs, API calls. They had highlighted certain lines in yellow and annotated them as anomalous. Someone had taken snippets of code, reassembled phrases from my late-night comments, and threaded them into a narrative that placed my credentials at the center of a loss. There were edited entries, the timestamps had been shifted. Whoever had done it had the technical skill to forge a trail and the political sense to make it look like I had hidden the damage. Aaron's name was not on the first page. Why would it be? He never had to tangle himself in the first sweep. His work was subtler. He was the kind of person who smiled when I walked past his desk and then presented my fix in a boardroom as a strategic model. He learned quickly, asked the right questions when leaders were present, and forgot to credit me when the applause arrived. I had mentored him because I believed, perhaps naively, that teaching someone else to be careful and rigorous was how you grew the team. He was good at listening when it served him and quiet where he needed to be. "What do you want from me?" I asked, more loudly than I had intended. HR's representative had a face I couldn't read, sympathetic enough to be polite, distant enough to be procedural. That was the precise moment I felt my role reduce from human to node. "We need to put a hold on your operations access while we investigate," she said. The words were smooth, but the implications landed like hammers. I pictured my credentials as a set of keys and watched an invisible hand turn the lock. Within 48 hours, the world shrank to the size of a service desk ticket. My badge beeped dead at the door. When I tried to pull up the internal dashboard from my workstation, I was greeted with a message that my account had been suspended. My email was archived. I could only access it through a portal that became a museum of my past correspondence. My desk, usually a chaotic map of sticky notes and hardware, was cleared and resealed with tamper-evident tape as if evidence had once lived there. I felt like a ghost watching records of my own life be boxed and labeled. My phone wouldn't stop. Messages stacked up in a blur, terse inquiries from legal, a calendar invite for a meeting I was no longer allowed to attend, a text from my sister that said simply, "Are you okay?" I couldn't answer any of them without clearing the legal hurdle. The buzzing built a kind of cacophony that made the small apartment above the bakery feel like a cell. I let it buzz and watched the number climb: missed calls, unread texts, a voicemail that I could only access with an account someone else now controlled. My inability to respond felt, perversely, like a second suspension, of voice, of presence. Colleagues who had once leaned on me in crisis crossed the room to avoid me. People who had eaten pizza at my desk and argued schedule trade-offs in the bright fluorescent light now pretended our paths were parallel. In Slack channels I had populated with scripts and wry comments, my absence became a hole. There were fewer in-jokes and hash ops, fewer late-night pings about a stubborn process. Somebody removed my name from an ongoing thread in a meeting and continued as if the omission had always been there. One of the junior engineers, a kid I'd stayed late to show how to analyze a corrupted log, bumped into me in the corridor and looked away as if embarrassed to meet my eyes. Shame is an odd animal. It wasn't just that I might be fired or financially compromised. That would have been a trouble I could meet with counsel and negotiation. The shame that muscle-locked across my back was the sense that every handshake, every "thanks, Marcus" on a bill ticket, every bit of trust deposited in me over a dozen years could be undone by a document stapled in someone else's hand. It was the possibility that years of quiet stewardship could be overwritten by a few lines of altered code, by a narrative printed and circulated in tidy, official fonts. I sat in my apartment and tried to catalog the friends who had once called me in the middle of the night and the vendors who had trusted my word. Each name felt suddenly fragile, as though one paper accusation could sever a dozen small ties at once. I pictured the whiteboards we had filled in with diagrams and dates, the shared history of a team. Would those sticky notes be admissible as evidence? Would they be read as the memories of allies or the residue of an old narrative? The worst part was the quiet acceptance in the faces of some senior people I had trusted. It wasn't overt hostility, it was the corporate instinct to minimize risk and assume the artful document at hand was true until proven otherwise. When the general counsel nodded at the packet as if it were an incontrovertible statement, I felt something like a physical blow. Years of proof of midnight fixes, of vendor phone numbers memorized, of emergency patches that had kept payroll systems humming were being weighed against highlighted text, and the side that won was the one that looked cleanest on paper. I tried to imagine a conversation that would reverse the tide. I rehearsed denials and explanations, the technical equivalents of pleas. Each one felt inadequate, like shouting in a language they had decided to stop understanding. The printed packet had more authority than my face. The certainty with which the company treated that packet, calm, administrative, unbothered by nuance, left me hollowed out by disbelief and the cold realization that my years of work could be judged less credible than a few doctored lines. I sat on the edge of my couch like I could put distance between myself and the dossier on my kitchen table. The apartment smelled faintly of the bakery downstairs and the half-empty mug of coffee on the counter. I replayed the meeting over and over, not the words exactly, but the small movements, the way the packet had been slid across the desk, the polite, bureaucratic tone that converted accusation into procedure. Each pass through the scene raised a new question and then another, and I chased them until the room blurred. It was ridiculous, the way my mind went back to a Friday 3 years earlier after the power hiccup that took down half the East Cluster. We had patched and cursed and pulled servers back from brownouts. The CTO called it a near miss. I called it a lesson. After that week, I wrote a script in a feverish 2 a.m. kind of clarity, daily snapshots of system logs, G-zipped, encrypted, and pushed to an independent provider outside the corporate perimeter. I remember the absurd care I took. GPG-signed archive headers, checksums logged to a separate file, multiple retention copies, and a private passphrase I memorized instead of storing anywhere online. At the time it felt like overkill, now it felt like my only lifeline. I went through that routine in my head the way an engineer runs through a recovery playbook. The backups ran on a schedule that did not depend on our central servers. They executed from a small, purpose-built VM I kept isolated for just that job. The snapshots contained every verbose log, every authentication handshake, every admin invocation. I hadn't designed them for litigations or HR drama. They were insurance against outages and corruption, but immutability is immutability. If those archives still existed, signed with my key and bearing those daily checksums, they would tell a story different from the one printed and bound so neatly in HR. Anger ignited first, hot and bright, the kind that makes your thoughts jagged, but it burned off quickly, replaced by an unnatural, precise focus. If there was one thing my job had taught me, it was how to let systems speak for themselves. I had spent years reducing arguments to logs and time codes. I wasn't going to trade that method for a spectacle of pleading. The packet had been authoritative because it looked polished and because the people making decisions were more comfortable with a tidy document than with messy recollection. Proof would be the only antidote. I pulled out a notebook and started listing contingencies like a checklist. If the backups were intact, what would I need to prove? First, the archives themselves unedited, signed, and timestamped. Second, an independent chain of custody. Provider logs showing who accessed the archive and when, ideally with non-repudiable timestamps. Third, a translation of technical artifacts into plain statements the legal team and executives could digest. Checksums that matched, signature verification with my GPG key, and a timeline that correlated server events with physical workstation activity. Fourth, a strategy for presenting the evidence so it could not be dismissed as tampering copies held by a neutral party, notarized prints, or a legal seal. Each item had contingencies. The provider might be subpoenaed, Aaron might have had access to local workstations, someone might argue that my personal key could be compromised. I anticipated every counterargument as if they were moves in a chess game. They could claim the backups had been altered after the fact. Fine, I'd need a provider with immutable storage and proven timestamping, not a throwaway host. They could say the signature wasn't mine. Fine, I'd bring in the public key history, the key server records, perhaps an old signed email I had sent that matched the key. They could suggest I was planting evidence. Fine, I'd minimize any action that could be framed as tampering. I would not post anything online. I would not email myself copies to company accounts. I would preserve originals and document every step I took. It is strange how planning can calm fear. The anger that had made my chest hollow gave way to a clinical rhythm: identify, verify, secure, present. I mapped time windows when access audits were lax, calculated how long it would take to retrieve a signed archive without leaving an access trail tied back to my corporate credentials, and wrote down the exact sequence I would follow to maintain an unbroken chain of integrity. I thought of the legal implications. Chain of custody matters more than theatrics, and of how one rash move could bury the truth in a new set of accusations. The old instinct to fix everything immediately had to be restrained. Evidence handled sloppily is evidence that loses credibility. I also thought about people who would support me, who might be complicit, who would panic when questioned. There was a risk in reaching out prematurely. A message sent to the wrong person could alert the very person who had framed me. The idea of involving my sister, of sharing the plan with someone I trusted implicitly, hovered for a moment, but I shelved it. This required cold, verifiable steps more than comfort. By the time the night ran its course and the bakery's lights dimmed, a plan had formed that felt less like revenge and more like a duty to truth. I would not stand in a room and ask to be believed. I would assemble a record that could not be rewritten with a highlighter. That thought, so simple and stubborn, settled in like a map unfolding across a table. For the first time since the packet had been slid across that HR desk, I could see a route out of the dark. I moved through the office like someone who knew every floorboard and thermostat, but who also carried the knowledge that a single creak could undo me. The security desk was friendly with the night guard and polite with my explanation about staying late to finish a migration. I used a personal laptop that did not bear the company wallpaper, a burner account I had created months earlier for code reviews, and a small USB key that held the passphrase I had memorized but also written down in a locked notebook at home. I pulled the archive from an independent provider the way I had planned months ago, the access happening under my burner identity and routed through an anonymized connection so it would not reflect against my corporate credentials. The archive unlocked like a chest I had sealed myself. Files sat in neat rows, G-zipped and named by date, each with a signature header I recognized at a glance. My heart thudded, but the feeling was less like fear and more like the same focus I felt when a broken server finally came back up after an all-night patch. For the next week, I lived in this narrow orbit. I came in after hours, sipped bad office coffee, and set up scripts on my laptop to verify checksums against the signed headers. I wrote small verification tools that did nothing to alter the archives, but that proved, in ways a lawyer could understand, that the bytes on disk were the bytes that had been pushed months and years ago. I compared server-side hashes and independent timestamp records with a kind of ritual. There were the G-zipped logs themselves, of course, and then the sidecar files I had left intentionally. Signed checksums, a public key fingerprint, and an external timestamping service record. Those redundancies were why I felt confident enough to proceed. If someone wanted to argue the backups had been tampered with after the fact, the timestamping authority and the provider's immutable write record would counter that. If someone wanted to claim the signature was fake, the key server entries and my long history of signed messages would rebut the claim. All of this I mapped out again and again, tracing the logic until it felt incontrovertible. The anomalies did not jump out as obvious sabotage. They were careful, subtle edits that a confident amateur could make if they knew what questions to raise. I found entries with timestamps nudged forward or back by a few minutes in ways that made a human narrative look plausible. I found administrative calls logged from an internal workstation that bore the access pattern unique to Aaron, the same keystroke timing, the same application sequence he used when configuring the deployment cluster. The most damning detail was a cluster of deleted commits in the repository history that coincided exactly with the morning the losses were reported. Those deletions were not random. They removed a handful of reconciliations and flagged balances that, if present, would have shown the discrepancy weeks earlier. I took nothing for granted. Every time I verified a checksum, I recorded the result in a separate ledger and then had the script output a signed report. I took photographs of the terminal screens with a separate camera so there would be no metadata tied to my work laptop. I printed selected pages onto acid-free paper in case digital chains were contested. When I printed, I used the guest printer that logged no user IDs, and I bagged the printouts in legal envelopes I did not mark. I carried the envelopes home in a laptop bag that smelled of old coffee and solvent, as if the scent could mask the evidence inside. I rehearsed how I would present the material until the phrasing came out clean. I practiced on the couch in my apartment, reading the timeline aloud as if delivering witness testimony. I anticipated every objection a skeptical executive or a seasoned attorney could make. They could claim the backups had been altered. Fine, I would show the independent timestamp and the write-once log from the provider. They could point to the signature and argue it was forged. Fine, I would produce the key server history and an archived signed message from a year earlier. They could say I was planting evidence. Fine, I would show every step I took to preserve provenance and the fact that I had not used any corporate channels for access. For each counterargument, I built a response that relied on immutable artifacts, public cryptographic records, and third-party logs. I did not sleep well, but I did not panic either. The work was its own refuge. It absorbed the outrage into detail, translated suspicion into files and timecodes. There was a strange comfort in verifying a hash or watching a signature verification succeed. Each successful verification felt like a brick being set into place, a slow masonry that would eventually hold up something larger than me. Quiet became the shape of my days and nights. I stopped answering messages that could be traced back to my motives. I stopped looking to allies. By the end of the week, I had what I considered a coherent, defensible packet. It contained the original archives, the independent timestamp records, printed copies of the most incriminating logs, the provider access logs showing IP addresses and times, and a document translating the technical artifacts into plain English with minimal jargon. I did not send a single item. I did not leak a line to a sympathetic colleague. I tucked the envelope of printouts into a locked drawer in my apartment and synced the verification reports to a secure location I controlled outside the company perimeter. This was not an act of triumph. It was the quiet patience of somebody who had rebuilt a case brick by brick and understood that timing, not noise, would win it. I chose the quarterly review because it was the one meeting that gathered everyone who mattered in one room. Executives, legal counsel, the board representative who liked to speak last because he wanted to look wiser, and Aaron, who sat with a small, smug smile like someone who already thought he had won. I arrived early, carrying a slim manila packet and a folder I kept hidden under my jacket. I left the outer door unlocked for the general counsel and placed one copy on the table by his laptop. I did not announce anything. I asked for permission to speak when the review turned to the reported losses, and I felt every eye shift in the room like a physical thing. I began with the simple things: who I was, how long I had been responsible for the systems, and a brief explanation of the backup routine I had put in place years ago. I could feel Aaron cocking his head, gauging my composure as if that would tell him whether I had a card to play. I placed the printed timeline on the table and then walked through the packet methodically, the way I would walk a junior engineer through a post-mortem. I showed the original daily backups, pointed to the signed checksums, then put the doctored logs from HR next to them. The side-by-side comparison looked almost theatrical, like two photographs taken from the same scene with different lighting. I explained the independent timestamps and the write-once confirmation from the provider, and I felt the room go quieter as the language got less technical and more absolute. When it came to the cut that mattered, I did not ask for theatrics. I simply played a replay of the system events tied to a specific workstation. The playback was not flashy. It was terminal output in real time with the keystroke timings I had captured and the server responses. The forensic trail revealed access patterns that matched Aaron's workflow to an uncomfortable degree. There were the same application sequences he used when configuring deployments, the same short pauses between commands that were his signature. I had prepared an annotated view that flagged those keystroke patterns, and I walked the executives through it like a teacher showing how a tool worked. The more I translated the binary traces into human actions, the less plausible any alternative became. Aaron's face was the first honest thing in the room. At the first slow reveal, he smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks a joke is still funny. When I showed the deleted commits and their timestamps, his smile tightened. He tried a few things in that moment. He offered a bland denial, then a technical justification that amounted to blaming system quirks. He suggested an external attacker, his voice smooth, practiced. When the legal counsel challenged him on the workstation logs, he shifted tactics and tried to claim that access might have been proxied. He looked at the board member for backup and found none. I felt none of the triumph I had imagined. Instead, there was a clinical satisfaction at watching the facts take shape. I had anticipated every dodge. When he suggested proxies, I brought up the provider access logs that showed concrete IP addresses and a sequence of authentication attempts that matched the workstation ID. When he implied external compromise, I introduced the key server records and the historic signed messages that tied the backups and my account into a chain that could not be rewritten without leaving evidence from multiple independent parties. I had prepared clear, plain English explanations for why each piece of evidence mattered. I did not gloat. I presented the information as if performing a function the company needed. That tone made it harder for anyone to call me partisan. At some point mid-presentation, Aaron tried to interrupt with indignation, his voice raised enough to draw a few glances. I let him finish, and then I showed the offsite copies I had kept and the photos of the terminal screens I had taken with an independent camera. Those photographs had no corporate metadata, and they matched the timestamps of the commits. He scanned a page in the packet and reached for it like a man trying to grab a ledge. His hand shook. He stammered an excuse about a helper who had access when he was on vacation. Someone in legal asked a straightforward question about privilege and chain of custody, and a silence settled that felt like a verdict arriving in echo. I watched as the combination of immutable backups, independent timestamps, and cross-referenced logs closed the room around his story. He tried to rewrite the narrative with charm and insinuation, but charm cannot produce hashes and time authorities cannot be smiled into oblivion. The general counsel rose, his face shifting into something that was not performance. He asked for copies of the packets, he called a forensics vendor he trusted, and he asked security to secure the workstations in question. That sequence of practical moves rendered the rest moot. He was given an opportunity to explain further outside the room. He asked too late for a chance to clear things up. Legal said their hands were now tied and that they had to follow protocol. Within hours, the company had opened an investigation led by outside counsel and a third-party forensic team. Within days, Aaron was escorted out. They put the letter in my inbox on a gray Tuesday, and the words were exact and procedural. Access restored. Investigation closed pending litigation. A note from the general counsel asked for my patience and offered a private meeting to discuss next steps. People unclipped themselves from my orbit as if they had been holding their breath and now needed to exhale at a safe distance. Opening my mailbox that afternoon was a relief that tasted more like antiseptic than champagne. Restoration came with paperwork and with 1,000 small, awkward conversations. Some colleagues sent messages that read like confessions. I got a dozen notes saying they had avoided calling me because they were embarrassed to be wrong. A few people dropped by my desk and left before I could look up, and one of them, someone who had been a friend for years, apologized and then asked if I wanted to grab lunch sometime. He did not follow up for 2 months. Those apologies were honest in the way bruises are honest. They did not erase the days when my phone stopped ringing and where, at the company holiday party, I had been a ghost. A few leaders who had been circumspect in the weeks before the review approached me with tones that felt rehearsed. They said the right things about due process and maintaining trust. Their words were spare and polite, and I accepted them because I needed to. Inside, I cataloged the moments when those same leaders had preferred plausible deniability to asking hard questions. Their quiet apologies never fully matched the sting of being doubted, but they were a start. One of them left me a card that said only, "I should have listened sooner." That small sentence traveled farther than any executive memo. My sister called and then drove over without saying more than she had to. We sat on my couch in the dark, and she told me she had read every update on the company thread and that she had told her friends that her brother did not do it. She was proud and cautious at once, like someone who has watched a house survive a storm and now worries about the foundation. Her hands were steady when she handed me a cup of tea. Later, she said something that stayed with me. She said, "You are always careful with the things that matter, and sometimes that is invisible until it is needed." I had protected systems for years, and I had not expected to have to protect my own name. On the pragmatic front, I did not wait for policy changes to follow my instincts. I secured the offsite backups in a fireproof safe and created an air-gapped retrieval routine. I split keys and introduced multi-signature processes where a single person could not effect a critical change. I wrote an internal memo about verifiable records and suggested an independent timestamping authority be adopted company-wide. When legal asked for my recommendations, I handed them a list that read like a checklist for trust. The checklist was not purely technical, it included human elements. Mandatory rotation of privileged accounts, independent custodians for audit trails, and a clear escalation path for suspected manipulation that bypassed normal managerial channels. The company updated protocols, which helped. They brought in an outside forensics vendor and mandated third-party audits. Security budgets increased. People who had once joked about shortcuts in the name of speed now read runbooks again and signed their names at the bottom of the pages. The culture in the operations wing shifted toward transparency. Stand-ups began with a short review of recent change requests and who had signed off. It was small at first, and then it became routine, like a habit-forming muscle. Even with the official fixes, something in me changed. For all the checksums and timestamps I had presented, the episode had exposed how much of our work rested on informal trust and on little social contracts. Institutions are fragile when fear or ambition takes over. I learned that safeguards are not only lines of code, but also the people who will insist on facts, even when it is inconvenient. I also learned how easily reputation can be weaponized. The knowledge of that potential felt like a tool and like a threat at once. I found myself looking at new hires more closely, asking not just what they could do with a system, but how they used their power when no one was watching. I never staged a party. There was no celebratory email. My vindication did not feel like a climax so much as a new baseline. I returned to the server room and walked it slowly, like someone reacquainting themselves with a body after illness. Hardware hummed, logs streamed, and the processes I had built continued their quiet work. I kept copies of the backups in more than one place, and I documented the retrieval steps with an independent witness for the record. I mentored differently too. I taught new engineers that the cleanest system is not the fastest or the cleverest, but the one whose changes are visible and accountable. I told them stories about what happens when people choose convenience over verification, and I taught them to bake auditability into their habits. There are nights when I still replay the meeting in my head, not for triumph, but to remind myself why I do this work. The relief of vindication sits beside a sobering knowledge that being believed can be a choice for others and a fight for you. I do not want that to happen to anyone else. So I rebuilt quietly, tightening processes and relationships, holding the backups like a promise, and watching the company slowly resew the torn places. I regained my job and, in a way, myself. I also gained a sharper sense of caution and of the responsibility that comes with custody of systems and of trust. That is a heavy thing to carry, but it is the kind of weight that keeps things from falling apart.